A single chord of a lonely guitar trembled through the night air, just moments before gunfire ripped it away. The horizon glowed with the flicker of flames, uncertain whether from the distant setting sun or the blaze of human vengeance. And there, at the edge of a dying campfire's glow, two silhouettes stood braced against fate, a wary singer clutching her instrument like a shield, and a silent blacksmith poised to prove that even silence can roar louder than gunshots. Wyoming Territory, 1876. The rolling plains stretched like a giant ocean of gold and green, rippling under an unrelenting sun by day and turning cold, ghostly silver under moonlight. Hemmed in by the rugged silhouette of distant mountains, small frontier towns dotted the landscape like lonely islands of humanity. One such settlement, Swift Rock, lay perched against a shallow stream, flanked by stands of thin cottonwoods whispering in the breeze. Within the ramshackle wooden buildings that lined its single dusty street, tensions always simmered. Ranchers, fur traders, fortune seekers, and outcasts converged here, each mind filled with personal dreams or regrets. The local saloon, the Coyote's Luck, was rarely without a drunken brawl or a lonely gambler, and a sharp eye could spot the shining steel of well-worn revolvers on many a hip. Yet amid the whirling dust and taut nerves, occasional glimpses of beauty would surface: children playing in the meager shade, women exchanging news, a battered church bell tolling at twilight. Into this milieu walked a traveling singer named Juniper Hayes, drawn by hope, memory, and the promise of a welcoming stage. There, too, in Swift Rock's humble blacksmith shop, toiled Silas Finch, a man of few words, forging metal with a determined quietness that set him apart from the constant clangor of rough voices. Their meeting was inevitable, but no one foresaw how it might change them both. Juniper Hayes had first arrived in Swift Rock on a blistering July afternoon. She came on foot, leading a tired, grayish-brown mule named Penny that carried her meager belongings: a worn saddlebag, a rolled canvas, and a battered leather guitar case. A short, wide-brimmed hat shielded her sun-kissed cheeks, and her hair, soft brown tied in two simple braids, framed a face lined by both laughter and sorrow. At 26, she had the practiced composure of someone who had wandered the frontier, singing her songs in saloons, boarding houses, and even open fields when nights had grown too cold and lonely. Her voice was rumored to hold a touch of magic, a melodic warmth that could ease a grieving heart or spark hope in a desperate soul. Though she sought fame and a measure of security, she was never one to chase big city stages. She preferred the raw honesty of small frontier towns, where her music felt needed. Beneath her courageous smile, however, Juniper carried a private grief. Months earlier, she had lost her younger brother to a railroad accident back east. It was sudden, cruel, and left her drifting, determined never to settle or risk seeing death claim another loved one within her reach. Each new horizon, she believed, might soften the ache inside her, but she found that even the strangest towns, the dreariest bunkhouses, still reminded her of what she had lost. Her goal in Swift Rock was simple, or so she told herself: earn enough from singing in the Coyote's Luck to buy a new horse. Penny was getting old and slow. Crossing the next stretch of wilderness would require steadier hooves. She hoped to travel northward, perhaps to Montana, chasing the rumor of a gold rush crowd hungry for musical diversions. Juniper's fear was the same as always: forming attachments. Traveling alone kept her heartbreak at bay. Yet there was a yearning in her that ached for companionship, a hidden desire to find someone who understood her burdens, who might stand beside her and whisper that the world could still be kind. Across the street from the saloon, the clang of hammer on anvil echoed from a low wooden structure, topped by a crooked sign that read Finch's Forge. It was a small building with a stone chimney and open sides to let the breeze carry away the smoke. Here worked Silas Finch, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s, known for his unwavering stoicism. He rarely spoke unless pressed. Dusting his thick, dark hair with soot and sweat, he spent long hours hunched over the anvil, forging shoes for horses, hinges for doors, or tool blades for ranchers. Some whispered that Silas simply had nothing to say. Others claimed he had once been a soldier in a war skirmish that left him troubled and broken. A few surmised he had loved and lost. But these were rumors, easily spread in a tight, knit frontier town longing for a bit of romantic scandal. The truth was simpler and more complicated all at once. Silas harbored a deep guilt from a day he could never fully explain or atone for, a day when his rifle misfired and caused another man's death. Though declared an accident by the traveling circuit judge, Silas had not forgiven himself. Words had failed him then, they failed him still. His life's purpose, as he saw it, was to shape metal and endure. Swift Rock needed him, for a frontier without a skilled blacksmith was like a horse without shoes, vulnerable to every jagged rock. Silas's biggest fear was letting down the town, or worse, allowing his shameful past to resurface. People's questions only deepened his silence. At times, he longed for a chance to speak out, to reveal the truth behind his hush. But fear of scorn sealed his lips. Thus he carried on quietly, forging tools by day, stoking the coals by night, and dreaming of a redemption that might never come. Juniper Hayes entered Swift Rock at midday. The heat shimmered along the dirt road, and her throat felt parched as if she had swallowed a desert. She sought shade under the awning of Finch's Forge, tying Penny to a hitching post near the corner. Silas was working at the anvil, hammer descending in steady rhythm on a dull, red piece of iron. She paused in the meager shadow, catching her breath. Lifting her brim, she caught a first glimpse of the blacksmith, face streaked with soot and sweat, forearms corded with muscle, a tanned brow furrowed in concentration. The way he hammered felt almost musical, but more than that, it reminded her of a heartbeat, unwavering, strong, methodical. Despite the risk of rudeness, she allowed herself a moment of fascination. "Afternoon," she finally said, voice hoarse with dryness. Silas only nodded, giving her a quick glance, then returned to his work. He spoke no greeting. The clamor of metal on metal continued. Juniper might have been offended if she hadn't noticed the flicker of something in his eyes. Caution, curiosity, perhaps recognition of her exhaustion. She offered a weak smile that went unanswered. Trying not to take offense, she made her way across the road to the Coyote's Luck. Inside, the saloon was dim and stifling, the smell of stale beer and smoky kerosene lamps clinging to the air. Juniper introduced herself to Maribel, the proprietress. After a sip of water, she offered her talent, and Maribel, always keen for fresh entertainment, immediately showed interest. By late afternoon, Juniper's guitar case rested on the small stage near the upright piano, awaiting her evening performance. Meanwhile, rumors of a new singer fluttered through the patrons, piquing mild curiosity. That night, as Juniper performed her first set, the saloon quieted in a way it rarely did. She sang a ballad about a ranch hand who loved the moonlit plains more than any woman, letting her voice wash over the rough crowd. Many men, whiskey in hand, listened with a tenderness they rarely displayed. At the bar, a young rancher whispered, "She's got a voice on her, doesn't she?" Another nodded enthralled. Though Silas never set foot inside the saloon that night, her song drifted across the street. From his forge, where he quenched glowing steel in a trough of water, Silas heard the melody. For a moment, the music stirred him with an unfamiliar ache, a longing, perhaps, to step out of the darkness and into the lamplight. But he remained at his anvil, forging away, silent as always. The following morning, Juniper ventured to the blacksmith's shop to have Penny's horseshoes checked. The old mule had a slight limp. She found Silas already at work, sparks jumping from his hammer as he shaped iron. Sunlight streamed through the open sides of the forge, catching the swirling dust motes in a golden haze. Silas acknowledged her with a nod. He dipped the hot metal in water, steam hissing, then set it aside. Wordlessly, he motioned for Juniper to bring Penny closer. Checking each hoof, he discovered a worn shoe that had loosened. He gestured that it needed replacing. "Thank you," Juniper said softly, running a comforting hand over Penny's neck. Silas bent to his task. The hush felt thick. At last Juniper, uneasy with silence, tried to fill it. "Your forging is well known in town. People say you make good, strong tools." He nodded in acknowledgement but offered no words. She wondered if he was ignoring her or merely shy. Then, to her surprise, she saw him glance at her guitar case leaning against a nearby post. His eyes lingered on it for a moment. "You heard me last night, didn't you?" Juniper guessed gently, recalling that the open windows of the saloon faced the forge. "If you liked what you heard, you should come tonight. I'll sing a new ballad." He looked at her, brow creased slightly. She thought he might speak, but then he simply lowered his gaze, focusing again on the stubborn nail fastening the horseshoe. The whine of metal on metal rose above their would-be conversation. Undeterred, Juniper pressed softly, her voice full of quiet sincerity. It'd be nice to have a friendly face in the crowd. When he lifted the horse's hoof into his lap, ignoring her, she gave a little shrug. Well, consider it an invitation. After Silas completed the work, he accepted her payment with a stoic politeness. Yet something in his eyes flickered again, a subtle shift of curiosity. Juniper left with an odd sense of hope, as though maybe she had glimpsed the faintest crack in the wall around him. That evening, she sang again at the Coyote's Luck, her voice weaving lively tunes of wanderlust and heartbreak. Whenever the saloon doors swung open, Juniper stole a quick glance, hoping to see Silas's broad shoulders and soot-streaked face, yet he never appeared. Even so, she lingered after her performance, sipping a small glass of whiskey. She told herself it was to soothe her throat, but some part of her lingered for reasons she didn't fully understand. Outside, a dry wind stirred. Thunderheads in the distance hinted at the possibility of a storm. And across the street, the lights of Finch's forge still glowed faintly, as though the blacksmith worked into the late hours under the watchful eyes of the moon. The next turning point arrived with more direct menace. Late that afternoon, a trio of rowdy travelers rode into town, reeking of whiskey and trouble, led by a wary man named Clay Jefferson. They had worn revolvers on each hip and a dead-eyed stare that told stories of savage days on the frontier. They swaggered into the Coyote's Luck just before Juniper's set, immediately commanding attention with their boisterous laughs and harsh demands for liquor. Juniper took the stage, heart fluttering with a vague sense of unease. She launched into a spirited tune, hoping to quell the tension swirling in the saloon. At first, Clay and his men seemed merely rowdy, hollering after each verse and slamming drinks. But as she began her second song, a softer melody about the sweet sorrow of leaving home, Clay started calling out to her with inappropriate remarks. "Hey, singer," he slurred, banging his shot glass on a table. "Why don't you come over here and sing something special for me?" Laughter erupted from the corner, a few men glancing away, not wanting to tangle with the newcomers. Maribel shot them a stony glare from behind the bar, but intimidation was in short supply. Juniper's voice faltered. She forced herself to finish the song, feeling the eyes of the rowdies crawling over her. When she concluded with a trembling note, Clay rose to his feet. "Now that's real pretty," he said, stepping forward with a wry grin. He placed his hat over his heart in mock gallantry. "Think a man like me could get a private show?" Despite her pounding heart, Juniper mustered her resolve. "I sing for the room, friend," she replied evenly, giving him a cool look. "You heard it just like everyone else." He took a threatening step closer. "But I want you up close, right here at my table." His rough hand jerked in a demand. The tension bristled. A few townsfolk reached for their sides, uncertain if they should intervene. Silence weighed heavy as dust motes swirled in the lamplight. Then a voice cut through the hush from near the saloon entrance. She said no. Heads turned. Silas stood in the doorway, arms folded, face grim. Clay raised an eyebrow, letting out a harsh laugh. "Who's this?" Clay asked. "Ain't never seen you in here." Silas didn't move, but his stare was unyielding. It said everything. The air crackled with potential violence. Clay sized him up, noticed Silas's large build, his burn-scarred forearms. But Clay also saw the blacksmith wore no visible firearm, only a sheathed knife at his belt. Slowly, Clay eased back, smirking. "Fine," he spat. "Didn't mean any trouble." He flicked a glance at Juniper and added with a sneer, "Next time, honey." Juniper exhaled shakily, relieved at Silas's timely appearance. A flicker of gratitude passed between them. Their eyes met across the candlelit room, and for a moment she wondered if he could see the relief shining there, along with a hint of fear. That night, she discovered something about the silent blacksmith. Though he seldom spoke, he was not indifferent. The storm of trouble might still be brewing, but for now, his quiet stance had warded off the immediate threat. After she packed her guitar, Juniper left the saloon, stepping into the darkness outside. Silas lingered by the hitching post, arms folded. She approached with a shy smile. "Thank you?" she whispered. "Didn't think you'd come." He looked at her, giving a soft shrug. His lips parted, and for an instant she thought he might finally speak. But he only dipped his head in acknowledgement, then turned to go. Juniper swallowed the H of wanting him to say more. Before he disappeared into the night, she found herself calling after him. "I'm grateful." He paused, glancing back with eyes that carried both sorrow and longing. Then he continued on, fading into the gloom, leaving Juniper by the saloon's lamplight, her heartbeat thundering with questions. The next day dawned with thunderheads massing. Plains storms in Wyoming territory could be vicious, lightning tearing across the sky, rain hammering the earth. By noon, the wind had picked up, blowing dust across Swift Rock's narrow street. Folks scurried to latch shutters and tie down loose items. Juniper spent the morning conferring with Maribel over a traveling route. Tomorrow, she planned to continue her journey north, seeking fresh audiences and the chance to outrun her lingering memories. Yet a quiet voice deep in her chest suggested staying in Swift Rock a while longer. The roads would be muddy and the streams swollen from the storm. Also, part of her wasn't ready to leave the silent man who had come to her aid. She wrestled with a pang of confusion at these emotions. Still, traveling had been her life. She assured herself that sentimentality had no place in it. Around midday, Clay Jefferson and his cohorts re-emerged, horses snorting in the rising wind. Their presence in town cast a dark shadow. They had made no further trouble, but everyone sensed their restlessness. In small towns, men like Clay usually spelled disaster. Under that gathering storm, Juniper felt uneasy, as though a final conflict might spark at any moment. She crossed the street to Finch's Forge, anxious about her journey, uncertain what she hoped to find. Silas was shutting the side shutters against the wind. Sparks leapt from the forge, swirling in the gusts, and the sky rumbled with distant thunder. I was about to settle my mule in the livery," she said hesitantly, "but I wanted to see if you had any advice on the roads north. Folks say the rains might flood them." He nodded, stepping out of the forge, dusting off his apron. A long moment stretched as the wind tugged at their clothes. Finally, Silas cleared his throat, a low, rough sound. Juniper's pulse hammered. It was the first sign of his voice she had heard. "Roads dangerous," he said quietly, each word seeming to cost him dear. "Swollen streams." Her breath caught. "You think I should stay here until it passes?" A pause. Then he gave a short, almost uncertain nod. Juniper smiled despite the seriousness of the moment. She felt a strange, fluttering hope at hearing his voice. "Then I'll wait," she said, her voice gentle. "Be safe in this storm." Silas gave her the faintest curl of his lip, an approximation of a smile perhaps. A gust of wind swept between them, swirling dust. As thunder boomed overhead, Silas reached up, gently touching a straw in Juniper's braid that had been lifted by the wind, tucking it back behind her ear. The gesture was brief and unpracticed, but there was a kindness in it that made Juniper's eyes brim with unshed tears. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps no one had touched her with such gentleness in a very long time. She opened her mouth to speak, but lightning flashed overhead, bright enough to make them flinch. Rain began to patter, and they rushed to close the forge's shutters. The storm broke with a furious roar soon after, confining them in that dim workshop. Huddled by the anvil, with the roar of rain on the roof, Juniper looked at Silas. For a heartbeat, the hush was so intimate that every breath felt magnified. "Thank you," she whispered again, and this time he nodded more freely, forging a moment of unspoken understanding in the gloom. By nightfall, the storm's fury eased into a steady downpour. Juniper was offered a small cot in the saloon's storage room, grateful for a roof. She played a few songs to lift the spirits of the storm-bound patrons, though the crowd was thinner than usual. Clay Jefferson and his gang still loitered, their sharp eyes watching Juniper from a corner table. Occasionally, one of them would step outside, glancing up at the swirling clouds as if impatient to move on. Tension brewed like the thunderclouds overhead. Sensing the danger, Maribel had discreetly armed herself with a shotgun behind the bar. A worried hush weighed upon the saloon. Juniper's music was the only softening presence, weaving through the damp air. Around midnight, most of the patrons turned in. Clay and his men finally rose, settled their tab, and left. Juniper hoped that would be the last she saw of them. But trouble often returns in the frontier. Well, after closing time, Juniper was awakened by rough hands pulling her from the cot. She gasped, heart pounding. The door had been forced open. Clay glowered down at her, reeking of whiskey and tobacco. One of his men pinned her arms as she struggled. "Little singer," Clay sneered. "We're leaving town in the morning. But first, I want my private show." Fear spiked in her. She thought about screaming, but Clay clamped a hand over her mouth. Panic ignited her veins, and she kicked out, knocking over a lantern that shattered on the floor. Flames licked at scattered papers. Clay cursed, shoving her against a wall. The flicker of fire illuminated his twisted, angry features. Her guitar case lay a few feet away, out of reach. At that moment, the door burst open again. Silas stood there, chest heaving, eyes blazing with fury. He must have heard the commotion. With a wordless roar, he lunged at Clay. The next moments blurred in the chaos of fists and curses. Clay's men attempted to draw guns, but Silas slammed an elbow into one's jaw, sending him sprawling. The small storeroom erupted in confusion, scuffling, and the acrid smell of smoke from the growing fire. Clay lashed out, pulling the trigger of his revolver. The deafening shot ricocheted in the cramped space, splintering a piece of the wooden wall. Silas flinched but pressed on. With a powerful swing, he knocked Clay's pistol from his hand. Clay reeled, cursing. Seeing the unstoppable rage in Silas's eyes, he scrambled backward, blood dribbling from his split lip. Maribel rushed in with the shotgun, eyes wild. Another of Clay's men had recovered enough to raise his weapon at Silas. Reflex took over. Silas bellowed, seizing a piece of broken chair, swinging it upward. The man's shot went wide, lodging in the ceiling. The next instant, Silas's makeshift weapon struck him across the head, knocking him out cold. Flames spread along the storeroom wall. Juniper coughed, eyes watering. She stumbled to her knees, reaching for her guitar case. Clay staggered upright, brandishing a knife. Before he could strike, Maribel fired a warning shot into the ceiling with her shotgun, forcing him to freeze. Smoke filled the cramped air. "Get out!" Maribel shrieked. "All of you, out!" Clay, panting and beaten, glared at Silas, his eyes full of deadly promise. "You'll regret this," he spat. Then he and the remaining conscious gang member fled, dragging their unconscious companion with them into the rain-soaked street. Juniper collapsed, coughing from the smoke. Silas grabbed a bucket of water, dousing the flames, while Maribel ran for more water from the saloon's barrel. After a frantic struggle, they managed to extinguish the fire before it spread beyond the storeroom. Acrid smoke hung in the air. The small window was shattered to ventilate. Exhausted, Juniper slumped against the blackened wall, trembling. Silas knelt beside her, breathing raggedly, concern etched on his sooty face. Even as she coughed, tears of relief spilled down her cheeks. "Yo, you saved me," she managed to say, her voice shaking. She reached out, tentatively placing a hand on his arm. Silas bowed his head as if ashamed, or perhaps shaken by his own fury. In that room swirling with smoke and fear, Juniper felt the unspoken bond between them deepen. She didn't know what or why, but she felt it. Silas had risked his life for her, and in the scorching glow of that near tragedy, She was left breathless by the realization that she cared about him more deeply than she dared to admit. Morning arrived in a subdued hush. The rain clouds receded, leaving mist in the gullies and a pale sunrise over the plains. Swift Rock's residents emerged, drawn by news of the overnight violence. Clay and his gang had vanished, leaving behind only rumors of vengeance. A bullet had lodged in the storeroom's wall. Burn marks blackened one corner. Juniper's cot was destroyed, but she and Maribel counted themselves lucky that no one was seriously injured. Silas retreated to his forge, sparking speculation among townsfolk. They whispered about how the silent blacksmith had fought off 3 armed men. Some recalled an old story that Silas was dangerous when cornered, that a dark past might lurk behind his quiet exterior. Juniper, meanwhile, felt only gratitude and concern. She made her way across the street in the early morning light, hugging her guitar case tight. A few townsfolk offered sympathetic nods, but she brushed them off determined. At Finch's forge, she found Silas leaning against the anvil, staring at the coals lost in thought. "Silas?" she called gently, stepping inside. He turned, eyes haunted. For a moment she feared he might push her away, but instead, he wiped his brow and gave a stiff nod, inviting her to speak. "I'm okay," she murmured. "I just wanted to see if you are." Silas met her gaze, and the sadness there nearly broke her. He glanced away, hands clenching into fists before loosening again. He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She blinked. "For what?" His voice was hoarse. "For what I did. I lost control." He looked at his hands as though they were stained with guilt. "Didn't want to hurt anyone?" Juniper's throat tightened. She stepped closer, daring to place a hand on his arm. "But you saved me. You were defending me. And yourself?" He still looked troubled. At last, words began to tumble from him in a broken hush. I was in an accident. Killed a man by mistake. Judge called it misfire. But I couldn't." He halted, voice choked with memory. Juniper understood. She could read the torment in his eyes. She squeezed his arm softly. "Sometimes we carry guilt for things that aren't our fault. But last night you saved a life. You saved mine." He exhaled slowly, eyes flickering with relief, or perhaps a fragile sense of absolution. Juniper felt tears prick her own eyes. She opened her mouth to say something further. Something about the emptiness she felt after her brother's death, or how she'd always run from attachments for fear of more loss. But before she could speak, a heavy pounding on the forge's outer post startled them both. It was Sheriff Bolton, a wary man with deep lines of worry carved into his face. Behind him stood several townsfolk, brandishing rifles. The sheriff approached, eyeing Silas with both caution and respect. "We got word Clay Jefferson is camped outside town," he said tersely. "He's threatened to burn Swift Rock to the ground for what happened last night." A murmur of unease swept through the men behind him. Swift Rock had no large militia. They relied on each other, but defending against a band of dangerous outlaws was risky. The sheriff exhaled. "We could use your help, Finch. Both of you," he added, nodding at Juniper. "We're outnumbered. If Clay means trouble, we might have to meet him outside the town." Juniper's heart hammered. She glanced at Silas, feeling a swirl of anxiety and resolve. She didn't know how to fight, but she knew she had to help, if only by standing with those who had protected her. Silas set his jaw, giving a single nod. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder gratefully. Thus they made their plan. At the creek crossing north of Swift Rock, where the road curved through a shallow ravine, they would confront Clay Jefferson and attempt to drive him away before he reached town. The memory of Clay's brutality spurred a quiet determination in Juniper. She wouldn't let fear paralyze her. Silas motioned for her to stay behind, but Juniper refused, placing her guitar aside. "I can't hide forever," she insisted softly. "I won't run." And in her heart, she also couldn't bear the thought of Silas confronting danger alone. They set out by late morning, a small group of determined townsfolk on horseback, rifles across their laps. Silas rode a borrowed bay mare. Juniper shared a mule with a rancher named Cole, her face pale but resolute. The sky remained overcast from the night's storm, and water drenched the plains, making the crossing slippery. The creek ran fast from the fresh rain, swirling with mud and branches. As they approached the ravine, they spotted Clay Jefferson's gang positioned behind rocks and sparse trees. Clay himself rode forward a few paces, scanning them with the same sneer he wore in the saloon. Behind him, a half-dozen armed riders waited, rifles and revolvers glinting ominously in the midday light. "Well, well," Clay called, voice echoing off the rocks. "Look who came out to greet us. You lot think you can keep me from settling my score." Sheriff Bolton nudged his horse a step ahead. "We don't want bloodshed," the sheriff announced. "But if you come for Swift Rock, we'll defend it." Clay laughed, the sound dripping malice. "That's so. I got business with the blacksmith." He pointed a gloved hand at Silas. "And that fancy singer. Bring him both out, and maybe I'll spare the rest of you." Silas glared, gripping the reins. Juniper swallowed her fear. All around them, the air bristled with tension. The reflection of men's scowls glimmered in the swirling creek. A hawk soared overhead, screeching once, as if warning them all. The sheriff's men spread out cautiously, rifles at the ready. Clay's outlaws did the same, forming a loose semicircle. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a leftover growl from the previous storm. For a moment, no one moved. Each side awaited the other's next move. Then Clay whipped out his revolver. "You best hand him over or else." His men raised their weapons. A few on the sheriff's side cocked rifles in response. The standoff balanced on a razor's edge. Juniper's heart pounded. She thought of her brother, lost in an accident that arrived with no warning. How quickly life could be snuffed out. She thought of Silas, weighed by guilt he never deserved, and the fragile bond they'd begun to forge. Part of her was tempted to step forward, to sacrifice herself if it meant saving the town. Yet her spirit revolted at giving in to Clay's cruelty. In that moment, Silas spurred his horse forward, stopping just short of the swirling creek. His gaze locked on Clay. He shifted in the saddle, then spoke in a voice that carried firm resolve. "You want me, fine. Let them go." A murmur of protest rippled among the townsfolk. Clay's grin broadened cruelly. He seemed to relish the idea of a final duel, or some twisted vengeance. "Brave talk, blacksmith." He cocked his revolver. "You remember how to shoot." Silas slid off his horse, boots sinking in the mud at the creek's edge. Thunder rumbled again. A hush fell. Then, with unsteady hands, Silas reached for the rifle strapped to his back, a battered old weapon he seldom used. He stared at it as if it were a viper. Memories of his accidental misfire must have surged in his mind. But he set his jaw, lifting the barrel. Clay dismounted, stepping into the muddy crossing as well. The two men advanced on each other. The hush grew agonizing, broken only by the drip of water from the trees. Desperate to prevent bloodshed, the sheriff shouted, "This is madness. We can talk." Clay roared back, "We'll settle this like men." Then he glared at Silas. "I'm calling you out. Show me that fightin' spirit from last night." Time seemed to slow as the two men faced each other, about 10 paces apart. The tension soared. Juniper found herself dismounting too, unable to remain a passive witness. She clutched her guitar case, heart hammering. Why had she brought it? She couldn't say, but holding it gave her courage. She stepped forward, voice trembling. "Silas, you don't have to do this." "Not like this." Clay let out a barking laugh. "Stay out of this, woman. You'll get your turn." A flicker of anger lit Juniper's face. Without fully understanding her plan, she carefully unsnapped the guitar case, pulling out the instrument. The sheriff's men watched in confusion. Silas stood rigid, rifle in hand, eyes locked on Clay. "Silas," Juniper pleaded, voice rising, "you're a blacksmith, not a killer. We can end this another way." Clay snapped, "He is a killer, and he's about to prove it again." A single drop of rain fell on the guitar's strings. Juniper's breath shuddered. She raised her voice, raw and defiant, singing a single sustained note that cut through the tension like a blade. Everyone froze, startled by the sudden melody in the midst of looming violence. She sang a ballad of heartbreak and redemption, a cappella at first. Her voice rose and fell, strong despite trembling limbs. The lyrics told of a man who once harmed another by accident, then spent years forging new tools for those in need, each blow of the hammer a prayer for absolution. As she sang, time stood still in that muddy creek. The men on both sides lowered their weapons in surprise. Even Clay seemed rattled, confusion flickering in his eyes. Silas trembled. Tears glistened. The raw truth of her song mirrored the anguish he carried. Then, with trembling fingers, Juniper strummed the guitar, the chords resonating against the hush. The notes rolled through the ravine, as if the land itself paused to listen. She poured all her grief for her brother, all her gratitude for Silas, all her hope that violence need not be the final answer into each chord. Clay, unsettled, spat on the ground. "You think your silly tune can stop me," he snarled. Yet he remained still, as if locked in place by an invisible chain. Juniper stepped beside Silas, continuing to sing. Her voice softened to a near whisper, carrying a plea for mercy and the power of forgiveness. Silas slowly lowered his rifle. Tears traced lines in the soot on his cheeks. He looked Clay in the eye, voice shaking as he finally spoke. "No more killing." Clay's face twisted in anger and confusion. For a heartbeat, no one knew which way the confrontation would swing. Then Clay roared, raising his revolver. A shot rang out. Juniper flinched. Had Clay fired? But it wasn't Clay's bullet. It came from the sheriff, who had taken advantage of Clay's distraction to disarm him with a carefully aimed shot. Clay's revolver flew from his hand, dropping into the muddy creek. Suddenly, the air erupted in shouting. Clay's men scrambled, exchanging gunfire with the sheriff's posse. Horses neighed in panic, rearing up. Gunshots echoed off the ravine walls. Clay dove for cover behind a rock. Silas, with raw courage, pulled Juniper down as bullets whistled overhead. She clutched her guitar, terrified. The dream of a peaceful resolution shattered in an instant of chaos. Yet the townsfolk were better positioned, their rifles aimed from higher ground. Clay's outlaws, pinned by the unexpected resistance, began to retreat. Clay, bleeding from a graze, glowered at Silas from behind a boulder. Another bullet from the sheriff's men zinged off the rock, forcing Clay to duck. Seeing no advantage, the battered gang leader finally hissed, "Fall back!" He and his men bolted, scrambling into the brush, leaving behind only swirling mud and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The sheriff's posse gave chase for a short distance, ensuring Clay's gang was truly retreating. Then the tension eased. Swift Rock's defenders slowly regrouped, panting, muddy, hearts pounding. Mercifully, only minor injuries had been sustained, mostly grazes. Juniper realized her hands were shaking around the guitar. She felt Silas's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. She met his gaze, relief flooding them both. They had come through the violence without taking a life. Clay's men might return another day, but for now, Swift Rock stood unburned. And in that muddy crossing, Juniper felt a profound gratitude, not just for survival, but for the bond that had forged between her and Silas under the threat of guns and guilt. Back in town, the sheriff praised Silas for his courage. The townsfolk crowded around, patting him on the back, offering thanks. Maribel beamed at Juniper, tears shining in her eyes. "You sang like an angel out there," she said, hugging her close. "Don't you doubt that gift of yours." Juniper blushed, humbled. Despite her efforts, violence had erupted, but at least no one had died. She found herself longing to stay in Swift Rock, no longer certain that her only course was to keep running. The little frontier town felt more like home than any place she had known in years. But later that evening, as she sat by a small campfire behind the saloon, her guitar in her lap, she wondered about her next steps. The storm had passed, the sky clear, stars twinkling overhead. She plucked a soft melody, weaving it into the embers' glow. She sensed Silas's presence before she saw him. He approached quietly, pausing at the edge of the firelight. She beckoned him closer, and he settled on a log beside her, staring into the flames. Silence lingered between them, but it was a comfortable hush now, not the lonely gulf of before. At last Juniper spoke. "This place, it feels different now." Safer, maybe. She glanced at Silas, her eyes reflecting dancing firelight. I was thinking I might stay a while, if that's all right. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Town needs a singer, he replied, voice gentle. She smiled in return. And a blacksmith, a good one. They sat there, side by side, listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint hush of night wind. For a time, neither had to say another word. In that moment, the unspoken promise of shared tomorrows eased the burdens of their pasts. They had learned that redemption can be found even in the silent forging of metal and the whispered notes of a song. And that sometimes, two bruised souls can help heal each other under the endless frontier sky. In the raw vastness of the American frontier, it isn't the loudest guns or the harshest threats that hold true power, but the quiet, resilient acts of mercy and loyalty. A voice raised in song can soothe wounds deeper than flesh, and a single act of courage can guide a wounded heart toward redemption. Even in the face of violence, a shared kindness can outlast the echo of gunfire. Thank you for listening to Melody Beyond the Campfire. A traveling singer meets a silent blacksmith. If you enjoyed this story of courage, hope, and the healing power of song, please like, subscribe, and comment to share your thoughts. Your support helps keep these tales of the frontier alive for all who seek them. We'd love to hear from you. What themes spoke to you the most, and what would you like to hear next? Let us know. Safe travels, and we'll meet again under the western sky. O1 Pro.